If you're rebellious, don't be. Basically, the state adopted stormwater management regs that are mandatory throughout the whole state for residential site improvement standards many years ago. They then took standards that are in those regs and they applied them uniformly throughout the entire state in 2006 or so based on 2004 regulations. And in about 2006, all municipalities had to adopt stormwater management ordinances that applied the initial stormwater management regs that were pretty much applicable to residential, to all non-residential, including commercial and industrial. And now those regs are being, as of last April, they were adopted and required all towns throughout New Jersey to adopt these updates to the stormwater management regs. So you can say you don't like it, you can say whatever you want to say, but you do have to do it, and it's mandatory and preemptive. And failure to do it would probably be some sort of Clean Water Act violation by the town and potential daily fines. So I don't recommend that to you. So basically, you're the implementing authority for statewide regulations.
The irony is that the state makes it more difficult to develop, and yet the state also tells you you have to accommodate more development for affordable housing.
And Larry, I will tell you that one thing that I've done in a number of the municipalities where I work is kick this down the road as far as we possibly could, because it'll be a real impact on the ability to develop some of those affordable housing projects in some places.
Yep.
Unbelievable.
Crazy.
Frank, is there anything further, since you wrote it, that you'd like to say?
He only wrote the consistency report.
Oh, okay.
And I sort of feel like I just farted in church, because everybody just finished telling us why this is such a horrible thing. And I've recited a whole bunch of stuff from the master plan that says this is just what the master plan was always talking about. So there are a whole series of goals that address these issues. There are some very explicit policies recommended that get right at the kind of strategies that are being talked about here. They don't do it in the way that Paul's referring to that'll be so difficult, which is quantifying those limitations. We just talk about managing how those things are done better. But these are many of the same kind of techniques that have been and will continue to be in the stormwater management standards. So the job we have here is it or is it not inconsistent with the master plan? And I can tell you clearly, it is not inconsistent with the master plan. I can also tell you it's consistent, but nobody wants to hear that because that's not what the statute says. So it's a double negative, I realize, but our master plan pretty clearly suggests that these kinds of techniques are in the interest of protecting all the natural and other environmental resources that our plans are based on.
Frank, it's Scott Zupnick. Is there any chance that this gets challenged as being onerous to development in communities like ours?
I'd probably want Tom to answer that instead of me, because I think he'd have a better sense.
Yeah, well, what'll more likely happen, Scott, I don't think there's a challenge to the regs which were adopted in 2020 in April. That would have been the point of the potential for setting aside statewide regulations. Challenges to those usually fail because administrative law is strongly supportive of the agency's actions. That more likely it's going to be the focus of the problems meeting the standards and case by case trials and tribulations with respect to the facts of compliance or non-compliance or waivers and mitigation. That the mitigation sounds incredibly complicated, and quite frankly, to a lawyer who understands this, it sounds impossible. So I think that will just continue to be a big problem.
So we're going to kowtow to it, and you got to do it.
You got to do it, and really the property owner has to figure out ways to do it. Now, that being said, you've seen some very nice rain gardens. I think if you've been at the back of the Pluckerman Inn, you saw the very creative rain garden work done by Ron Kennedy and the Pluckerman Inn owners. And there are really some great results from green technology requirements. Whether they can be fully met is another whole, let's call it a future set of issues. And but all what's happening for us now is we, as part of the referral report from the, when I say us, the planning board, all that's happening for you tonight is, you don't have to like say you like it or don't like it. All that you're being asked to do by the council is, because you're required to under the municipal land use law, is to be asked whether you find it consistent or at least not inconsistent with the master plan. I agree with Frank that it is not inconsistent with the master plan. That's what the statute says to find. It probably is consistent with every master plan in New Jersey because we always have plans that say positive things about the objectives and goals of protecting groundwater and surface waters for their water quality and their water quantity and preventing flooding and protecting the general welfare. So it's like apple pie, you can't really say basically it is something that is laudable. All we are asked to do though is say whether it's consistent with the master plan or not inconsistent. And I recommend that you make a motion to find it, after you open to the public, make a motion to find it not inconsistent with the master plan and let the committee move on with their second reading and their public hearing. And hopefully they will adopt it and they won't get fined by the DEP for violating stormwater management regs. And Paul can tell you more about that because I'm surprised, but towns actually get audited for whether they do what they're required to under stormwater management regulations, which is amazingly complex and kind of scary when you think about the state can audit towns for compliance with stormwater management. But they do, and I guess they could find towns too.
Tom, so it's a laudable goal. There's no one here, I don't think, disputing that, as an objective, it's not a good idea. But would we, on any particular application, could someone seek relief from these standards because it's too expensive, because we've got clay and the perk isn't good and all those kinds of things that are going to make compliance that much more expensive here in Bedminster than it might be in a Sandy Lam kind of town?
Well, Rich, what the standards for relief say, that if a developer is going to ask for relief, in order for you to grant that, he's got to show that there's no way he can do it. He has to find a mitigation
No way,
project.
or just it's too expensive?
He has to find a project that would cost as much as him installing it on his property. So money is not an issue.
Yeah,
If it'll cost
money's
him
not
$15 million to comply on his property, then his mitigation project has to cost $15 million someplace else. Those are the standards.
That's why I think, Rich, it's kind of like on a case-by-case basis, it will be potentially request for waivers or exceptions pursuant to those requirements. But frankly, to be able to do a mitigation project off-site, it's like pulling teeth. It's just so hard to find some place to mitigate on that. Basically, what will happen is property owners will look for ways to comply on site and reduce their impervious coverage and reduce their, parking perhaps, or whatever they need to do to try to open up some green space to provide for infiltration and water quality and bioretention. And so you're going to see, and I think sort of this, that you're going to see more like rain gardens and swales and infiltration basins in the bottom of detention basins. I can't remember if you had any of those, but
Didn't the school up on Pottersville Road do a bunch of that stuff too?
yes, and right, and yes,
Willow.
And they did it not because they were required to, but because they wanted, I think because maybe they had to too, but they wanted to show green
How it could
technology.
be done, yeah, okay. Well, maybe that's our primer that we hand out with our applications.
Okay, we will open it up to the public. I don't think we have anybody. Do we, Janine? Has anybody else checked in?
No, just the applicant.
Okay, so we'll close it to the public. And I guess we need a motion to approve this to go back to Township Committee.
To find it not inconsistent with the master plan and recommend that to the Township Committee.
Correct. Okay,
I'll make the
Is that-
motion. George.
George,
I'll second it. Scott.
and we need a roll call.
yes, please.
Roll call.
Mayor Jacobs,
Aye.
Committeeman Hickey,
Aye.
Mr. Strackhoff is absent, Mr. Travellini,
Aye.
Mr. Vergilius,
Aye.
Mr. Leonard,
Aye.
Mr. DiGiovanni,
Aye.
Mr. Zupnik,
Aye.
Ms. Orabana,
Aye.
Mr. Walter,
Aye.
Chairwoman Gutschall.
Aye. Motion is passed.
And Madam Chairman, for Janine's purposes, Janine, all you do is you send a memo to Judy Sullivan when you can soon before her second reading, and you inform her that the board found that the ordinance was not inconsistent with the township's master plan.
Include Frank's,
I'm sorry, yes, and attach Frank's memo of finding.
and Paul, are you appearing at the public hearing to walk the TC through this?
When is that public hearing?
I think it's the 15th.
Week from Monday.
Oh, no, but it's 15th a holiday? So
It is a holiday.
So it may go to the
Not
16th.
yet.
President-
Let me check my calendar. I think I've got a couple of things that night because everything got kicked from the 15th, but let me look at that. I'll figure out a way to do it.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, we have a resolution for our professional service. We, as you remember, didn't add Chuck to our professionals last month, so we want to approve Chuck Olivio as our traffic engineer. So I need a motion for that.
I'll move that.
Need a second?
Second.
That's George. Thank you. I guess we need a roll call on that as well, Janine.
Okay. Mayor Jacobs,
Aye.
Committeeman Hickey,
Aye.
Mr. Strackhoff is absent, Mr. Travellini,
Aye.
Mr. Vergilius,
Aye.
Mr. Leonard,
Aye.
Mr. DiGiovanni,
Aye.
Mr. Zupnik,
Aye.
Ms. Orabana,
Aye.
Mr. Walter,
Aye.
Chairwoman Gutschall.
Aye. Also, we have an annual report that's made at the beginning of each year for the past year. And we need a motion to approve that. It's basically a list of all our applications for last year.
So moved.
Yeah, well, why don't we, before you even vote or make a second, let me just explain this to everyone.
Okay?
You, as a zoning board, and you sit as both, but you still vote this as the board, the full board. Well, as a zoning board, you're authorized to do an annual report that summarizes your actions over the past year. This is also an opportunity for the zoning board, which is technically different than the planning board, to recommend things to the governing body and the planning board, and communicate things that you find worthy of communicating. And sometimes it includes something as esoteric as saying, we recommend the committee consider changing the side yard from 15 feet to 20 feet for whatever reason. It's not binding upon either the planning board or the committee to do something like that. If I knew of anything that I knew you wanted to recommend, maybe I would put it in here, but I can't think of anything that I thought you would want to specifically call out to recommend to the governing body. And you can do that at any time by the normal process of just doing recommendations to the governing body. But this is that one time of year that you're supposed to talk about and think about whether you really have any key things that you want to dialogue with the committee about. Anybody have any big hot
Yeah.
topics or anything?
Anything on the board that anyone would like to discuss? Not hearing anything, we will take a motion.
So moved.
I have a thought.
Yes, Rich?
Seems like we are consistently granting some latitude with respect to our height restrictions. I don't know if we want to talk about that, but it seems to be like the first thing to go on these applications. So I don't know if we want to change it from, it's 45, right, Frank? I mean, Paul?
And the vans on,
In most
Is that what-
districts, it's 35 feet.
35 feet.
30, it's 35 in most zones.
Yes.
And we've gone to 45 on a couple of projects already. We're talking about going to 50 now. Is that something that we want to give some latitude on in the ordinance with the, you know, with some limitations?
well, Rich, when you talk about going to 55 in the ORVMU zone, you're talking about a specific new zone that would only apply in that zone. So that's commonly does include different heights than other zones. When you're
Well,
talking about,
didn't we give elite 45 feet in,
yes, that was, or 40 something, that was one of their requested D variances. So you didn't, you actually, that was the main reason, one of the main reasons why you had a D variance triggering zoning board jurisdiction.
Mhm.
And granting it there does not grant it anywhere else in the VN or other zones. So I defer to you all. I don't care about this subject so much, but this is the type of subject where if you thought you wanted to change the height of a zone, you might give a recommendation to the governing body. I don't think we have like a uniform height throughout the whole township. So I wouldn't, if you were going there, the normal uniform height in most residential zones is only the 35 to 2.5 story, 35 feet.
Which is pretty much where we're at, right?
Right.
Generally speaking, we
So
do
if they
have
want to
some,
go over that, they've got to come before us looking for a D variance, which is, I think we probably would want that to be more restrictive, that rather than to just open that up in the, in an ordinance blanket for the entire, town.
or an entire zone. Well, that's a
I
lot of,
would only consider it, Scott, for certain specific zones, like, like something along Lamington Road or Main Street, something along Pluckerman Road or Burnt Mills.
I don't know. I'm kind of on board with Scott. I think that's why we have the applicant can ask for a variance. I don't think we want to open that can of worms right now.
I feel like it should be case by case.
Yeah, I
Unless
agree.
we're-
I agree with Scott and George also.
Yeah, so do I.
Unless you're planning to add a story, the 35-foot height limit goes with 2.5 stories, which easily fit into that limit. So if we're talking about a need for more height, it would only be like what we're doing in Pluckerman in response to a new type of development that needs that height. But I think in general, we should stick with what Scott said.
All right. I just thought it was an idea because, we're just bringing it up now, but I feel like we've offered some latitude on it on a couple of recent applications. So,
this is definitely the dialogue, Rich. This is great. This is what you talk about at this time. And let me just add something to all this. And it might not just be the height. I'm not saying you're going to change anything, but it might be the use that is triggering your concern about height or more flexibility as to height. So for example, maybe that's when it's in a townhouse or apartment building, that is more the issue. or maybe it's all uses, or maybe it's offices and mixed use buildings only. And that gets a little complex to do in a zone. And it also gets a little complex, Rich, to say the height on a certain street in a zone is higher than the height that is not on that street in that zone. There are ways to do things like that, but it's complex because you're supposed, strangely enough, zoning is supposed to be somewhat uniform throughout the entire district, according to the statute. It's a kind of a standard of the statute that's been ancient since the 1920s or 1930s. It isn't always followed precisely, but basically you usually do have one height in an entire zone.
Well, the thing that I'm thinking about, and again, it's not that big of a deal to me. We can certainly deal with this on a case by case basis, but what we've found on a couple of applications over the last couple of years is because we want to maintain this, gable type of form, depending on how big the building is, depending on how large the spans are, et cetera, the gable detail makes the height of the building get higher and higher and higher, depending on how big the spans are. And then we're looking at some ridiculous solution to that problem by putting a flat roof on a building that, we hate, in order to get it under the height limitations. So, I don't think this is something that we can discuss necessarily to, at least to my satisfaction, in 10 minutes. I'm happy to kick the can. I'm happy to leave it the way it is even, but these are the issues that we found ourselves dealing with. And again, I don't think anybody wanted to see a flat roof on Elite, for example, just in order to get it under the 35 feet. But, I think we had a project a couple of years ago. Somebody had this huge, ring for their horses, and it was, 3 feet over the limit with the, because we forced them to put a weather vane on the top, and a cupola was part of the design, and, and all this stuff that we try to incorporate for the sake of design, and it just pushes it over a reasonable limitation. So, we can deal with it on a case by case basis for sure, but, more often than not, we've granted it rather than, restrict it on the applications where it came into play.
Right, but Rich, I think the problem with that is that if we raise the limit, we certainly leave open the door for people to take advantage of that. And then we wind up with a 45-foot tall flat roof building that looks like a giant, Walmart warehouse. Right. And so if we're going to approve it on a case by case basis, if we acknowledge that, like the aesthetics are important to us, and the mitigating factors are important to us, and we're willing to look at those things, and it's not a comply with the zoning or go away scenario, then we can address it, right? And the applicants know that, certainly if you look back at the contested hearings, what we're looking for is pretty consistent. And we just sort of set the parameters for anything beyond that becomes something that we need to look at.
Yeah, like I said, we can certainly leave it the way it is, but we put people through a lot of time and effort on these things for something that we seem pretty amenable to.
Yeah, I agree with Ann. I think it depends on the specific design that's coming in, and we look at it independently.
Enough said. I made my point.
Mm-hmm. No, good points, Rich, but.
Yeah, very good points, everybody.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we are ready for a motion to approve this. If I hear.
So moved.
Scott, and then Ann a second.
Okay. Roll call.
Mayor Jacobs.
Aye.
Committeeman Hickey.
Aye.
Mr. Strackhoff is absent. Mr. Travellini.
Aye.
Mr. Rodelius.
Aye.
Mr. Leonard.
Aye.
Mr. DiGiovanni.
Aye.
Mr. Zupnik.
Aye.
Mr. Urbana.
Aye.
Mr. Walter.
Aye.
Chairwoman Gutschall.
Aye. Motion approved. Okay. We have here the master plan draft again for February 11th. Are we going to talk about it anymore tonight, or that's just a memo for next week?
I think that's just a memo for next week, but prepared to talk about anything anybody had questions about.
Anyone on the board have anything about next week's meeting? Okay, we'll pass on. The subcommittee for the escrow fees, we have a memo is going to the Township Committee with a new schedule, and it's a combination of both the subcommittee and Paul's input. Janine, when does that go to Township Committee?
I believe that I'm still waiting for Paul to finalize.
I thought I put that together and sent it forward.
No, I thought you had to.
Okay.
Okay, so
I'll
yeah,
check back and then I can.
I think you can give that to Judy for Township Committee for their next hearing.
Okay.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer those, but I think we're ready to go. And thanks, Paul. Thanks for your help on that. Appreciate it. Let's see. Any more? Okay, so we have Lamington Farms, that's on postponement for time being. And we have 20 Route 206. That's been ready to go, Paul, or when do we have?
Yes, we've got that on the agenda for March 4th.
That's what I thought. Okay, so that's good. Okay, and so we're ready for B&D Associates, the applicant.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, Larry and Colin. This
Hi,
is
guys.
it.
Good night,
Yeah.
fellas.
Have a good night.
Good night.
You're gonna miss us.
Should I start?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, good evening. Michael Osterman appearing on behalf of the applicant B&D Associates. B&D Associates is the owner of the subject property for this application, which is located at 336 Main Street and identified as Block 34, Lot 7 on the township's tax maps. The applicant has owned this property since 1993. The property is located in the VN zoning district. The property contains an office building as well as a storage building that is commonly known as the barn building because it's barn-like in appearance. In 2013, the applicant obtained development approvals from this board to construct the barn building, which replaced an existing storage barn that had been located on the property in the same location. The prior building had been used by the applicant and by another tenant to construct, I'm sorry, the prior building had been used by the applicant and by another tenant in the office building to store furniture and files, and that building had become unsafe and needed to be replaced. Within months after the new barn building was constructed, the office tenants no longer had a need to use the barn building for excess storage, and that building became vacant. And we'll have some testimony on why that happened. In the interest of being entirely transparent and upfront with the board, I will tell you that when the barn building became vacant, the applicant didn't realize the distinction between an accessory storage use and a principal storage use, and the applicant went and leased the building to a plumbing contractor who stored his plumbing supplies in the building. That plumbing contractor was not a tenant of the office building. After the plumbing contractor vacated the barn building a few years later, the applicant continued to lease the barn building at least to another tenant or two for storage until last year when the applicant had occasion to speak to somebody in the township's code enforcement office about a prospective barn building tenant and learned that the use of the barn building for storage by someone who was not a tenant in the office building was not a permitted use of the barn building. Once the applicant learned that, they stopped leasing the barn for storage purposes and filed this application for a use variance. As the applicant is now aware, a storage use of the barn building by a non-office tenant would not be accessory to the principal office use on the property and would be considered a second principal use of the subject property. While the VN zone does allow multiple principal uses on one lot, storage is not a permitted principal use in the VN zone, thus requiring a use variance, and the applicant has applied for that use variance. In addition, the applicant also requires and has applied for side and rear yard setback variances for the barn building. Those are required because the side and rear yard setback requirements for a principal building are different than the side and rear yard setback requirements for an accessory building. Specifically, an accessory building is required to have side and rear yard setbacks of 10 feet. When the barn building was approved as an accessory building in 2013, it was granted variances to allow it to be located in the same location as the building it was replacing and to have a side yard setback of 1.01 feet and a rear yard setback of 1.69 feet. If the barn building becomes a principal structure, then the ordinance requires a minimum side yard setback of 15 feet instead of 10, as well as a minimum rear yard setback of 15 feet instead of 10 for a rear yard adjacent to a non-residential use. So those are the variances that we've applied for. As noted in the application, the applicant proposes to add a single bathroom to the barn building. This is being done for convenience purposes so that when someone happens to be at the barn building, they don't have to use the bathroom in the office building. And one of the reasons that's important, as you'll hear, is that the office building has limited hours of occupancy on certain days and may not be open when someone who's using the barn building may be there. With respect to parking, please note that there will only be one tenant in the barn building. And that tenant will be allocated one space adjacent to that building that can be used for parking and loading. The barn building lease will specify that the barn building tenant is limited to one parking and loading space. As you will hear in the testimony this evening, while there had been a need for accessory storage use of the barn building by the existing office tenants in 2013, the office tenants' needs changed after the new building was constructed, so that since 2013 or 2014, there has not been a need, well, really since 2014, because it was a little after the building was built that the need went away. But there has not been a need for accessory storage in the barn building by the office tenants. The applicant has tried, but has been unable to find an office tenant that has a need for accessory storage in the barn building. At one point, we thought we had someone who did have that need, but they ended up not signing a lease. While there are permitted principal uses that are allowed in the VN zone for the barn building, and multiple principal uses are allowed in the VN zone, this building and this property are not set up to accommodate those other principal uses such as retail and service uses and professional offices, banking, and so forth. And that's because there would not be enough parking on the subject property to accommodate those uses. The impervious coverage on this site is maxed out, and there are really only enough parking spaces for the office use. There really wouldn't be enough to accommodate retail or service uses in the barn building. In conclusion, I think what we will demonstrate is that a principal storage use of the barn building is the logical use for that building. It was built for a storage use, and that use as proposed would have only one tenant and would require the use of only one parking space. So no additional parking really would need to be added to the site. With that, the way I'd like to proceed this evening is to call two witnesses. Ms. Janine Kradiger, the property administrator for B&D Associates, and Mr. Keenan Hughes, who is a licensed professional planner. So with that, I'd like to call Ms. Kradiger.
Yes, Ms. Gradiger, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do.
Thank you, and please state your name and spell your last name and give us at least a business address.
Janine Kradiger, Krattiger, 336 Main Street, Bedminster, New Jersey, 07921.
Thank you, and please go ahead.
Good evening, Ms. Kradiger. What is your position with B&D Associates?
I am the administrator of the property for the owner
Okay, and how long have you been associated with B&D Associates?
for 19 years.
Okay, and is B&D Associates the owner of the subject property?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and how long has B&D Associates owned that property?
Since 1993.
And what do your responsibilities for B&D Associates entail with respect to this property?
I manage the buildings and property, including finding tenants.
Okay. Were you involved in the 2013 development application for this property?
Yes,
And were you, and did you testify before this board in connection with that application?
yes, I do.
Will you please describe the two buildings that are located on the subject property, beginning with the one closest to Main Street?
The main building is approximately 2,300 square feet and has 3 stories. The first floor and second floors have offices and the third floor is empty. The barn in the rear of the property is approximately 1,400 square feet and is used for storage. That is currently empty also.
Okay, thank you. Before the barn building was constructed in 2013, was there another building in that location, in the location of the barn building on the subject property?
Yes, there was an existing barn that was actually deteriorating.
Okay. And how was that prior building used by the applicant? And when was that prior building constructed? Do you know?
The barn at that time was used for storage by the main office building tenants. I actually don't know when the barn was originally built, but believe it was around the same time as the main building was built in the early 1900s.
Okay. And but obviously it was there when B&D bought the property in 1993, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yes. With respect to the current barn building, did there become a point in time when the office building tenants no longer had a need to use it for storage purposes?
Yes, shortly after the new barn was completed, the office tenants, after purging all the items they had stored in the original barn, they no longer had a need to store anything in the new barn.
Okay. And so when was that approximately? When was the
Around
new building?
the end of 2014.
Okay. And how has the barn building been used since that time?
Well, for a little while, it was vacant until we eventually leased it to a plumber contractor who used it to store plumbing supplies. After he left, it was empty for a while until we found another tenant. We've only had one tenant at a time and allowed one parking space for the barn tenants. We also have a sign on the barn door allocating the barn tenants one parking space.
Okay. And how and when did you discover that storage as a principal use was not allowed in the barn building?
But this past summer, I had someone interested in renting the barn who said they would be using it to store an alcoholic beverage. After going back and forth with a tenant about space, then contacting the township about storing alcohol, that's when I learned that the barn use variance only permitted storage by the main building tenants.
Now, is the barn building currently vacant?
Yes, it's vacant.
And what is the applicant now proposing to do with that barn building?
I'm looking to rent it to someone who is not a tenant of the main office building.
And what type of tenant would the applicant be seeking for this barn, for the
Well,
barn building, if this application is approved?
I'd really like to get a contractor or a subcontractor such as a plumber or an electrician. No one that would be selling or distributing anything from the barn. What we would do is we would allocate only one parking or loading space for that tenant. We wouldn't allow anyone that has a vehicle larger than a box truck. Someone also that loads or unloads in the morning or the evening, so they're not there during the day, hopefully. Also, we wouldn't allow anybody to use exterior space for storage. And I do want to say we had a really good experience with the plumber contractor we had originally. He was only there maximum once or twice a day, if that. He came in the morning and at night.
And how long was the plumbing tenant there, or a tenant at that building?
Just about 3 years.
Okay. Ms. Gradiger, have you seen Mr. Ferraro's report dated January 26th, 2021, and Mr. Banish's report dated January 28th of 2021?
Yes, I have.
In his report, Mr. Banish lists lawfully permitted uses in the VN zone and notes that multiple principal uses are permitted on this same lot in the VN zone. Are you familiar with those permitted uses in the VN zone?
I am.
And could B&D Associates make use of the barn building for any of those permitted principal uses?
No, and the reason for that is because the other permitted principal uses would all require multiple parking spaces, and we're not able to add additional parking spaces to the property. Also, the barn building is not set up for those type of uses. It's really only set up for storage.
Okay. Next, let's talk about the proposed bathroom. In Mr. Banish's report, he asked for testimony explaining the need for the proposed bathroom. And in Mr. Ferraro's report, he raises some concerns regarding the proposed bathroom. First of all, would you please explain what is proposed in terms of bathroom facilities in the proposed barn building and why that bathroom is needed?
Yes, I was proposing a small half bath under the stairway on the first floor, purely for convenience of the barn tenant, but I also feel that having a bathroom would make the building more rentable. A tenant could potentially use the main office bathroom, but sometimes there isn't anyone in the office, and the hours are limited there.
Do you understand Mr. Ferraro's concern that a storage tenant could try to use the barn building for office purposes?
I do.
And would the applicant be willing to agree as a condition of approval to include a provision in all leases for the barn building expressly prohibiting any office use of the barn building?
Yes.
And finally, would the applicant agree to a condition that there be no exterior storage on the property?
Yes.
Okay, no further questions.
Does the board have any questions?
Barn is
Yeah,
not-
I have a few, whoever wants to. So can I just ask, what is the principal business B&D Associates? What is their function?
Just B&D Associates owns the building. And then one of the owners, Duff Meyercord, has Meyercord Advisors, which is a consulting firm. And he's also a managing partner in a larger consulting firm in New York City called Carmarks Advisors.
Okay, a couple more questions. The inside of the building, is it just a big open space? Does it have 2 floors to it? Is it set up with shelving or work countertops? Can you describe the inside of the building for us?
Certainly, it's 2 floors. The first floor is a big open space. The plumber actually installed some shelving a couple of years ago, which we left. And then the second floor is another just big open space.
Okay, and then can you describe your neighbors, your next door neighbors, and your backyard neighbor and all that?
Sure. So directly behind the barn is a parking lot. And to the left of the barn is the schoolhouse buildings owned by Mark. I'm sorry, I don't remember his last name.
Yeah, Mark Miller. Okay. Okay, thank you.
One thing I should have added, and I'm sorry I didn't, is that the barn is temperature controlled, and it does have heating and air conditioning.
Okay.
That's what I was going to ask. So it is sheetrocked inside the barn?
Yes. Well, the first floor, I guess it is. It must be. It looks like a warehouse when you walk into it. It's got a concrete floor. It has 2 garage doors that are enclosed with barn doors, so you actually can't see them from the outside for aesthetics. But the first floor is a concrete floor with a small like storage closet, which is where I potentially would like to put the bathroom. And the second floor has like a laminate flooring on it.
Okay, so so you have to go upstairs. That's more, that wouldn't be so much for storage. That would be more of like, I hate to say it, but an office.
Yeah, no, but there's nothing really, well, it could be, but we don't want it. We're not proposing an office.
How is that enforced then? I mean,
well,
if there's a bathroom there, the likelihood of it becoming an office is much greater.
We would certainly, first we'll add it to the lease that we're not permitting an office. And we're looking for a tenant that's not an office type tenant, somebody that's purely going to store something there, electrical equipment, contracting equipment, whatever it happens to be. And hopefully not that often.
Okay, but with the bathroom.
With a half bathroom, yes.
Is there plumbing in the building? I know you have climate controls in it. Is there any plumbing in it now?
No, there's no plumbing. There's actually an outside spigot, but there is no plumbing on the inside of the building.
You'd have to bring the plumbing in. And the other question is, because you're seeking a different tenant, do your tenants in this location pay their own utility, like electrical bill? Would you have to have a separate electric service for it and all that?
Correct.
Okay, so that would have to be something that would have to be done. So
They
okay.
would have to pay electricity and gas.
Okay.
Anyone else on the board have any questions?
You're talking about hi, this is Rich. You're talking about using it for a storage or some kind of secondary purpose, but presumably somebody might have their office someplace else and just be storing materials here or inventory here that they'd gather at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, as you described it. But since it is heated and air conditioned, could this work as some kind of studio, an artist studio, those kinds of uses? And Frank, would that kind of use be permitted here?
Are you asking me that question?
So first for Janine, and then Frank, you can answer the second question.
I haven't had anybody approach me with that concept of using the barn for that. First of all, if it's like a dance studio or something like that, I wouldn't want anybody. I don't want people in and out of the driveway or additional cars or anything in that respect. Somebody for an artist studio, maybe. Honestly, I'm trying to be very selective of who would I be renting the barn to, because we're not looking to have somebody there 5 days a week, there all day long, coming in and out of the driveway constantly. We're just looking for like a quiet, somebody to just store items in the barn.
I think there's somebody around the corner who welds artwork. So I was wondering if that sort of use would be a possibility. And for Frank, would that kind of use be permitted, Frank?
It might well be permitted, but I don't think we're not being asked for that. The building has a very limited potential to serve any other use without damaging the site's ability to handle the use that's already there. So, I mean, are there other permitted uses in the zone? And do any of them get close to what we were talking about a minute ago? There are, but they're not what we're being asked for. And I don't think we should be exploring that in a big way.
So I have a question. Does the tenant have to come to the township for some kind of approval? Any tenant or just certain tenants? How would that work?
That's a question for Tom, I think.
Oh, well, that's why they're here. Yes, they have
Let me try to
come
answer
town.
that maybe, because any change in tenancy requires a change in tenancy application that both the zoning officer and I review. So the answer is yes, because we would review that proposed change in tenancy against what approval may be granted by the board. As you've already heard, the buildings like this become enforcement issues because, there were uses in there that were not permitted that frankly the township never knew about. With the plumbing contractor that was in there, that's not a use that would have been permitted if a change of use had come in. It may have been an innocent mistake by the property owner, but it's an enforcement issue for the township, which is why really the nature of some of the comments in my letter, I'm concerned about the fact that if it becomes too comfortable, it'll be comfortable. And then it needs more seating. And while it's everybody's best intention that it is one thing, things change. And that can be problematic, particularly because of the fact that based on the parking standards in the township, there's any parking that is allocated for this building makes the parking for the front building non-conforming because it needs all the spaces that are there.
I mean, I understand that the owner may want to put a bathroom in there, but it's storage. I mean, if it's storage, I don't see the need for a bathroom.
I agree.
George, that's what I was going to say. That putting a bathroom in this place just adds for the purpose, more purposes available. And you don't need a bathroom for storage. And I think that just becomes a nuisance to it. So I would be not in favor of putting a bathroom. I think it should be used just strictly for storage.
I'd be more comfortable with the bathroom if it was just convenience, if the space wasn't heated and cooled, but that this idea that Paul's talking about habitable, it just makes it more and more habitable with the bathroom. It's got plumbing, it's got heat, it's got cooling, it's got a finished floor on the second floor. It could easily become, something that was, that somebody stretched the definition of the permitted use on without anyone knowing about it. And I think the bathroom just makes it easier to do that.
I agree.
Yeah. Like you can't even have the bathroom in it without heat anyway, because it would really be a maintenance issue. I have a question. How long, and if you said this already, I apologize. How long has the barn been empty?
Just about a year.
It's been about a year, so right about when the pandemic started, and the whole issue with for the owner, for your company is that you can't find a tenant that can use both the barn and the main building. That's really been the issue here, if I understand correctly.
Well, the issue really is if we want to put a tenant in the barn, they have to have office space in the building.
Right.
We haven't pursued that.
You haven't been able to find somebody who can.
We haven't tried.
Okay.
Oh, you haven't tried?
No.
Oh.
Ms. Cradiger, didn't you have one tenant lined up who ultimately didn't sign a lease, but who was going to take space in the office? I remember us discussing that at the time.
When we found out about the use variance, and we had when I was talking about the tenant over the summer, we started down the road of, okay, well, we can give her office space because we have so many empty offices in the main building that maybe we would do that. But the tenant just fell apart. She sort of disappeared and didn't take the lease. So I never pursued it. And since then, I haven't bothered to look for a new tenant. I'm just trying to figure out what we're going to do with the use variance and see if we can get it approved for somebody that's not a tenant in the current main building.
Tim here again. Do you think it would be worthwhile maybe trying first to find a tenant that may be able to use the office and the barn rather than maybe ask for a change of use first?
I mean, it could be with COVID. I stopped the process of even looking for a tenant. So I started down the road with trying to change the use variance, and then I haven't bothered to look for another tenant. I haven't listed it or anything. And also the main building, there's only the attorney's the only person, and then one of my colleagues goes to that office a couple of days a week. So there's no.
Is that building fully rented, the main building?
Well, we have it set up for 2 tenants, but we do have offices on the first floor as part of the first tenant that are not being used.
Right, and the 3rd floor that you said was empty in that building, is that rentable or is it just basically?
I don't think it's rentable. I don't think
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it's not rentable or,
the question, the way I should answer is, I'm not sure.
Okay.
We've never.
what do you
tried
mean?
to-
I don't understand that.
I was just asking Tim if the third.
No,
floor-
I don't understand the
yeah,
response. I don't know if
gotcha.
it's rentable or not. Has it been rented in the past?
I've never rented the third floor. I've
Oh.
never tried to rent the third floor, so I don't know.
Is the, Ms. Crediger, is the third floor set up for office use or is it more set up for storage?
That's what I was asking, basically.
There's actually an office on the third floor.
Okay.
That's an office space area that's empty.
Not an apartment.
I'm sorry?
It's not an apartment. The third floor
It's
space.
not a dwelling. It's not a residential apartment, I think is what he's asking.
Oh, no, it's not apartment. No, it's not an apartment.
Okay.
Any more questions from the board?
I have a question for our professionals. How would they define this request, or is it a conditional accessory use? Is it a conditional permitted use? How would you define what this application is?
It's a request for a use variance for a second principal use that is not a permitted use.
Okay. So it's not an accessory use, it's a second principal use.
If it were an accessory use, it'd be accessory to a tenant in the main building and they wouldn't be here.
Okay.
I believe that's currently. So,
Right, if just so people remember, if their tenant or a new tenant or the current tenant were to use it for storage, that would be accessory to that tenant, to the principal use, to the principal structure. It would be still an accessory structure and an accessory use and would be permitted. They now want to change that to be a principal use and a principal structure, and that's why they're also asking for those C variances from the rear and side yard requirements for a principal structure. So it is a use variance.
So I have a different question for Paul. Paul, if this little barn was turned into a residential property or residential, would it then be permitted as a secondary principal use on the property because it's residential in a mixed use zone, VN zone?
I think for residential use to be permitted in the VN zone, it has to be in the main building. I don't know if it could be a separate building, but even if it were, variances would be required because of lack of parking.
Okay.
And as Mr. Osterman said, as soon as you turn this accessory structure to a principal structure, then you have to meet principal structure setbacks, and the barn does not.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's not a variance-free or, as of right application.
Paul, is there some reason that we didn't include storage as a permitted use in that zone? I mean, is there something we're trying to avoid?
What comes to my mind is warehouses, but I'll let Frank weigh in on that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Why isn't storage permitted as a principal use in the VN zone?
I can't tell you. I can't think of a good reason right now. Hasn't been in the past.
Typically, this is Tom, typically storage is considered a warehouse use, which is considered an industrial or economic development use. Even storage rental facilities, you rent your storage spaces are typically either a prohibited use or they're permitted use in industrial warehouse zones. So it's not common to have storage as a permitted principal use in commercial zones.
Right, but also those developments wouldn't be 1,400 square feet. They'd be.
That's right. You don't
14,000
normally, almost no one does this. what they're seeking to do. You know, but typically this type of building is used for storage for the occupant of the building. And quite frankly, for parking spaces for the users of the building.
It's used as a garage, pretty much.
That's right, a garage, and it's commonly done.
Hey, Paul, would this variance, did the 200-foot notice apply to the neighbors? Do they know what's going on?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, or Tom. Okay.
Yes, that they get noticed. They got
They got-
noticed.
Okay.
That was provided, that's in the paperwork, right? Jeanine?
Yes.
So the plumber was not a tenant, Janine? And was
No, he was not.
using it illegally? Until you figured out it wasn't permitted?
Yes, I didn't realize it wasn't permitted.
So somebody down the street in the neighborhood next door even who wanted to use that garage as storage couldn't without this relief.
No off-site user can use the property for storage use. An on-site user, the owner of the property, can use it for storage. And they got approval to use it for storage for the tenant.
And it's the VN zone, right?
Yeah.
The end zone.
What about the VN2 zone? Would it change?
No. I would say to you, I'm not aware of any zone in which storage is allowed in a commercial zone. I'm pretty confident in my experience. I mean, you know, am I certain? I do a lot of this and I do it for storage facilities, and basically you often have to have sort of use variance just to have a rental storage facility. And you usually are looking in industrial zones for those, where warehouses are already a permitted use.
I would be in favor of the application as long as it were approved without the bathroom. And I don't know how other people feel, but if somebody want to speak up and talk about it further?
Madam Chairman, if I could just weigh in on one thing, and it goes to the contractor use of the building. I know the tenant that was there was, sounds like a very benign contractor. I've seen many contractors who are not so benign. I'd be concerned about overnight parking of vehicles. Having, you know, if the plumber comes in his personal car, leaves his big van there overnight, and then leaves his car during the day. I don't know if the board is concerned about it or not, but that's a possibility. If you're going to look at this, you're going to look at prohibiting overnight parking or any other things, because at the end of the day, whatever the board decides becomes something that has to be enforced through the zoning officer, and the clearer direction he has, the better.
You know, Paul, that's why I brought that up earlier. You know, I don't have a problem with the owner wanting to rent it out for storage. I think that's reasonable. But I mean, if the if you were considering storing alcohol there, I don't think that's I mean, I don't know what kind of alcohol, but you know, that concerns me.
Well,
I wouldn't think hazardous material storage would be a good idea for the structure.
Let's let the
Janine, perhaps you
applicant,
can elaborate on the alcohol tenant. It was maybe you could explain to us what type of tenant that really was.
Yes, it was a person that lived in Basking Ridge that was starting a startup hard cider, and no, hard seltzer company. And she was looking for a place to store the product.
And ultimately,
But as I said, that I actually called the town to find out if it was allowed. And that's when I found out about the use variance, but we didn't get any further than that.
It's very important, your lease and your hazard.
yeah, let's not worry about let's let the applicant present the rest of their case because they have a planner that they'd like to present to explain why they would like to have a use variance. And I think we're getting into the level that is for site plan after we even focus on the use variance a little bit.
Wasn't that another expert? Okay.
Before
They
we
have a planner.
before we move on from Ms. Crediger, I just had a follow-up question
Sure.
pertaining to the bathroom. Ms. Crediger, in terms of enforcing the prohibition on an office that would be in the lease, did you indicate that B&D Associates has an office in this building and would be there on a daily or almost daily basis to see what was going on?
Yes, well, we have an office manager that works in the back office of that building.
Okay, and would that office manager be able to verify that only one vehicle was parking on a daily basis at the site for loading and unloading? And yeah, and wouldn't your office manager be aware if the tenant started using the building for office purposes?
Oh, yes, she definitely would, and she would let me know. Yes.
So B&D Associates could very easily enforce that prohibition on office use, correct?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Let's go back to that though, Mr. Osterman. Ms. Credinger, if that's so, couldn't someone just rent 100 square feet or a small office in the office building and store their storage for their use in the building and use the bathroom with a key that you gave them because they rented space in the principal use? Why are we talking about a bathroom when you could solve all your problems with a requirement that the tenant lease space in your main building? Why is that so hard? Why? Tell me why that's not doable, practical, resolves the bathroom problem, resolves the access problem, resolves the
third floor.
I don't even care if it's a third floor. I don't understand why, you could have someone there to monitor whether they park one car, but you can't let them in for the bathroom. I'm having a real hard time with that.
Well, I mean, we could let people in to use the bathroom, and that's absolutely fine. The reason why I was proposing it was more for convenience to a tenant than anything else, other than having to come into the office. Sometimes the office is not open, and that's why we started down this road.
Yeah,
But if they lease space in the office, this problem is solved, right? And we don't even have a C variance for rear and side yard. We don't have a D variance. We don't have.
They don't even have to be here.
Well, you might have to be here because I don't know. I'm trying to understand what the problems are, but.
Lease that third floor apartment for $1 a year and solve all the problems.
Yep.
Yeah, you gotta give them access to your main building, and they gotta be a tenant of the main building. Maybe you don't want to do that. I don't.
Why, Tom, why do you think they have to be a tenant in the main building?
Because that's what
access.
because they have to be accessory to the main principal or
But
office use.
that's what was approved before. They're asking not to.
Yes,
be.
I know that, but I'm trying to solve this because I don't.
That also gives them access to the bathroom.
Yes, access to the bathroom, the need for one parking space. They need, I don't know, just a practical solution. It didn't sound like we heard an awful lot of testimony about efforts to try to lease it as a separate, lease some space in the office building for a tenant who would use the storage. I mean, how hard is that to find somebody? Somebody did it before and it wasn't B&D.
Well, Tom, if I could just clarify, we didn't really hear testimony about what the storage use was, but I will tell you, and we can get into a little bit of testimony on this. I will tell you that the office use has always been the principal use of the property. And when the the barn building was being used for storage, that was clearly accessory storage to the office use. I think you're now suggesting that the storage use would be the principal use and the office use for that
No.
tenant would be accessory.
I'm just saying that the office tenant, somebody in the office should lease some space in the office, and they also lease the right to store their accessory goods, their car, something for their office. Maybe it's something they sell in the storage building that they control via their occupancy of the office space in the main building. That must have been what was happening before, because otherwise the testimony we've heard so far was that, that my understanding of your testimony so far is that the prior owner or occupant of the main building stored their furniture in that storage building, the old storage barn, in the past. And that became unnecessary somehow in 2014. So go back to that protocol.
Ms. Cradiker, could you just explain to us what was previously stored in the building? Wasn't it files and things like, maybe you can explain to us exactly what was stored in the barn building by the office tenants?
So when I came on board in the early 2000s, the barn at that time was deteriorating. Just so everybody's aware of, the roof was sort of caving in. The floor was dirt. There was furniture. There was a couple of odd pieces of furniture in there. There was a lot of file boxes that probably had been in there for years. One of the owners of the building, Brian Barefoot, used to own the sports facility in Bridgewater. So he had a lot of leftover supplies and items of that type that were sitting in the barn. When the barn came down and it was time for us to rebuild it and they were taking the barn down, the tenants, the owners, whoever had anything stored in the barn removed it. A lot of it was garbage. They threw it out. Some of the pieces and the furniture was, I don't know what happened to the furniture. I think some of it went to the main building basement, but essentially everything was removed. And we built a new barn, thinking that we might store files or something like that in the new barn. It turns out after we cleared it out and the barn was rebuilt, there was really no need for any of the tenants or the owners of the main building to put anything back in the barn. There might have been some files. I think I remember files on the second floor, but other than that, we just had no use for it.
They didn't figure that out beforehand, though? They didn't go in and say, okay, we don't need any of this stuff, but let's build a barn anyway?
Well, we had to build a barn because the barn was falling down. It was 100 years old. The roof was crashing in. I mean, we were just afraid at some point a major snowstorm or windstorm was going to take it down.
Rather than just knocking it down and not building anything, you decided you needed a barn.
If we rebuilt it, we had the ability to use it just for storage for the tenants or whatever we needed it for. So we didn't want to lose the space, and we built a big, beautiful barn that's sitting there empty. So we want to be able to use it.
All right, if there's nothing else from Ms. Cradiker, perhaps we can call Keenan Hughes, our planner.
Yes, Mr. Hughes, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
Yes, I do.
And Keenan, please state your name, spell your last name, and give us an address.
Keenan Hughes, Hughes, 33 Newark Street, Hoboken, New Jersey.
And I think, well, Mike, you can present testimony. I think Keenan has been qualified and accepted by the Bedminster Planning Board, but I'll defer to you two, gentlemen.
Okay, well, first of all, Mr. Hughes, by whom are you employed?
Phillips Price, a planning firm based in Hoboken.
And what is your area of professional expertise?
I'm a licensed professional planner, and I'm a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. And we represent municipalities as well as private clients throughout the state on planning and land use matters.
And you're licensed in the state of New Jersey?
Yes.
Okay. we can have Mr. Hughes provide additional testimony regarding his experience, but if he's been previously qualified before this board, perhaps you want to just accept him. I'll leave it up to the board.
Carol, you want to hear any more on Mr. Hughes?
No, that's fine. I'm okay.
Okay.
I
Thank
think
you.
the board will just accept his qualifications as a professional planner, and please go ahead, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Mr. Hughes, have you reviewed this application
Yes, I have.
and have you been to the subject property?
Yes.
And have you reviewed the relevant provisions of the Bedminster development ordinances?
Yes.
Would you please give us your professional opinion regarding the requested variances and whether there's sufficient justification to warrant the granting of each of the requested variances?
Sure. And I'll just get sort of right to the point here because obviously I think the board has all the background it needs on the site and the application itself. But obviously, this proposed storage use is not used in the VN zone that's already been established. In addition, we're requesting those 2 bulk variances for the setbacks as this is being converted from an accessory structure to a principal structure. But in order to meet the criteria for use variance, we need to demonstrate that this site is particularly suitable for the proposed use. And I would point out the following. First of all, this is obviously an existing building, number one. It's always constructed for storage use. So it's simply a vacant existing storage building suitable for the proposed use. Adequate parking and loading can be provided on site to support the tenant, which is, as testified earlier, 1 parking/loading space would be allocated to the use. And we also know, as we heard from Ms. Kradiger's testimony, that this building was previously used for the proposed use. And at least to the applicant's knowledge, there were no issues in terms of impacts to neighbors or the surrounding community generally. And then finally, I would just point out that the site itself is surrounded by non-residential uses. So there's no residential uses directly abutting the garage or even the property itself. So I think in terms of evaluating this use, what's really important for the board, and certainly to the extent it's inclined to look favorably on this application, is to really put some conditions around what I think we've already testified to in terms of the tenant that the applicant is looking for. So first of all, obviously we're looking for a storage tenant. So that would be the use, it's storage. Secondly, vehicle no larger than a box truck, preferably similar to what the plumbing tenant had, just, sort of a cargo van would be ideal. They would be limited to 1 parking/loading space. There would be no distribution activities occurring out of the storage building, no offices within the storage building. As you heard from Ms. Kradiger, constant in and out activity is not desirable. So, they're looking for a tenant that's coming very intermittently, maybe just once in the morning and then returning in the evening. No exterior storage would be permitted. And no hazardous materials would be stored within this structure. So just kind of how this relates to the township's master plan, its overall planning and zoning efforts, I would say growing and supporting the non-residential land use space within the VN zone, it's always challenging because you have so many small lots with existing historic structures. And I think here you have an opportunity to more efficiently use an existing commercial property in a manner that's not going to adversely impact the neighbors or the surrounding area along Main Street and the VN zone more generally. So in that sense, I think the grant of a use variance here would promote the general welfare by supporting the local business environment and allowing for a more productive use of a commercial property, again, in a manner that's not going to adversely impact the area. So in that sense, it would advance purposes A and G of the municipal land use law. In terms of the negative criteria, it's my opinion there would be no substantial detriments to the surrounding area. Again, this storage building abuts commercial uses and a parking lot. The master plan does emphasize maintaining the character of the VN zone. And certainly this proposal is not inconsistent with that concept. We're simply using that existing quite attractive accessory storage structure on the property, converting it to a principal structure. And again, based on the agreed upon conditions here, around what type of tenant could be occupy this building, I think it's suitable for this particular property. Again, will not cause detriments on the surrounding area. Jumping back to really the question, I think it was Commissioner Orabona asked earlier about why storage isn't permitted. I think it makes sense that storage isn't permitted. Typically, I agree with Mr. Collins. I mean, you're talking about larger scale storage uses. Typically, this is really a unique situation. I mean, that downtown Bedminster, the village is not suitable for an extra space, large scale self-storage facility, at least on a smaller lot on Main Street. So this is really a unique situation in that the property is already improved with this existing very attractive storage building, which is sitting vacant. And the use variance would allow a single tenant that meets the criteria we have established to utilize the building for storage purposes. And as you heard from Ms. Cradiger, the existing on-site tenants do not have use for this storage space this time, and it cannot be easily converted to a permitted principal use. And I would further add, just in response to, I think one of the issues Mr. Collins was just raising is, why couldn't you just find another tenant, or couldn't this tenant just take office space in the principal structure and be considered a principal use on the property, in which case it could, by right, use the storage building for storage. I think in that situation, my concern would be, I'm not sure someone like a plumber or a similar contractor would be considered a permitted use in the VN zone. So I think for flexibility reasons, we're trying to, broaden the range of potential tenants to include those, because the plumber worked so well in the past, as you heard from Ms. Cradiger. So in that sense, the approval of the use variance to allow storage in this particular situation can certainly be reconciled with the fact that storage is not a permitted principal use in the zone, again, because this is such a unique situation on this property. And in conclusion, the applicant satisfies the positive and negative criteria for the requested use variance. And then finally, as for the requested setback variances, these are all subsumed within the use variance, essentially. The building exists, and the change from accessory to principal, based on the conditions that we've outlined around a potential tenant, will not create any substantial detriments to the commercial property that exists to the side and rear of this building. So as was stated earlier, the building was previously used for such purposes without any issues. So I believe the bulk variances we're requesting can be granted along with the use variance for the storage use. And with that, I think, unless Mr. Osterman, you have anything further for me, that would conclude my direct testimony.
Yes, just wanted to ask you if you've seen the reports that were received from Mr. Ferraro and Mr. Banish.
Yes, I have.
And would you please address any remaining open issues with respect to those reports? I don't recall if we've covered every issue in those reports.
I believe, looking at both of them, I think all of the issues and or questions that were raised in both reports sort of already came to the surface during the context of Ms. Cradiger's testimony. Obviously, if I'm mistaken, I'm happy to address any outstanding questions or issues the board may have, or professionals for that matter.
I would ask Paul and Frank whether there are any other issues from your reports that remain to be addressed or that you'd like further testimony on.
Not from my report, thank you.
I think that, my question would be, it relates a little bit to something Tom talked about at the very beginning as to, we're talking about use variance. Do we talk about site plan? There were some sketches, Mike, that you prepared that showed some parking on there. I took exception to some of those spaces because I don't think most of the ones that are on there really are legitimate parking spaces. And the site is maxed out with the parking that it is. So I think that creates some constraints on the property. as it relates to whoever uses that barn. I don't know if the board wants to hear any more testimony about that. We've heard some testimony about that. B&D could be the enforcement agent here and keep an eye on the building and make sure nothing is happening that is not envisioned. And I think that's noble. That's a great thing. But is B&D going to be in that building forever? Is the variance condition, it was one of the conditions of the variance that the owner occupy the building and make sure that nothing happened in the rear. I think that's a difficult thing to deal with, and I think it should be set up so there's clear language that's enforceable that the zoning officer can deal with, because I don't think we can count on, nor do I think it's reasonable to say that B&D must occupy the front building and be the enforcement agent. So those are just my 2 cents as to what you might want to do if the board were to approve this.
I just have to say, I just don't understand why the applicants going through all this time and expense when they could just have someone. I mean, they're already using it for storage. They're allowed to use it for storage as an accessory structure. That third floor isn't being used. Just on paper say, fine, this person's using that and they could use that as an accessory structure. I don't think the bathroom was going to fly. That's just my opinion. But I think you would have avoided all this, correct, Tom?
Yeah,
if they had a lease.
Do we
Yeah.
want people to do that? I mean, like,
People can do that all the time. That's what I'm trying to say. That's permitted.
yeah, but
That what they did in the past was permitted. What they did in the past is either B&D or some tenant stored, and apparently he had his other business offsite, but he stored things. He had a tenancy in the office building, and he also stored his furniture, his papers, his equipment in the storage site on the property. And guess what? When you lease space in the building, you also get the right to park in the parking lot for at least one of those spaces, and perhaps more than one. So that makes it 3 spaces. So I'm really having trouble with why we are trying to stretch this to deal with a problem that is actually solvable under the current ordinance. And
I agree.
I don't agree that with the planner that a plumber can't have an office there. And he didn't really say they can't. A plumber is just, and like anyone else, they can have an office and they can rent a garage in their office site. They can park their car, they can park their truck in the office parking lot. So all of this is permitted if it's done that way. Then you don't need a bathroom. You don't need to limit them to 1 parking space, because they have the garage and they have office space that includes a parking space. If we see that on the site plan, and I'm beginning to doubt that we actually have enough parking here. So I don't know how we avoid talking about the site plan if we're going to go for a use variance here. But if we're going to go for use it as it was used before, as accessory to an occupant of the office building, your application is denied, but you're allowed to do that. That's workable. I'm having trouble with why not do that. I mean, we didn't even hear testimony that you can't do it from Mr. Credinger. So it's not as though. My point is, yes, they can ask for this, but yes, the board could say no, and they could still do it the way that I'm saying. And so maybe they ought to just do it the way that I'm saying, because we're trying to jump through hoops to find ways to control it by not having a bathroom that they want. Well, use the bath, give them a key to the office building because they're a tenant of the office building, and you don't need a bathroom. And you get an extra parking space that way.
So Tom, you're suggesting.
I mean, it's very likely, isn't it likely, Mike, isn't it likely that the tenant of the garage is going to have a truck there, and he's going to drive up to his truck in his car, and he's going to need the truck space and his car space, just like Paul said. So if he actually leases space in the office building, he has a key to it. He goes in anytime he wants to go to the bathroom. go to his office, have his 2 cars there, it complies. Maybe. I'm beginning to doubt whether you have enough parking spaces if you didn't have a site plan. I
Well,
kind of remember.
we submitted a plan that showed 11 parking spaces on the site, including 4 along the driveway. And with regard to the 4 along the driveway, those are spaces that have been used for years, as long as this owner has owned this property since
But they've never been
1993.
approved to be used that way, Mike.
Well, it may be a
That makes the driveway too narrow to use.
pre-existing non-conforming condition.
I'm sorry?
It may be a pre-existing non-conforming condition because it's been going on.
I
for a
don't think
long,
those
long time.
parking spaces were approved on the site plan that had the barn, having the barn rebuilt.
Yeah, this came in for site plan. I remember this case. I don't remember the parking spaces, but I mean, I'm trying to make it simple. And the simple thing is, we don't have a need for this bathroom for storage, but yet you want to be able to give access to somebody. So I don't know. It just seems so obvious to lease space. You lease a 200 square foot office space in the office building to a plumber, to an electrician. I don't think there's any prohibition against that. I don't think there's any under the current ordinance. I'm having a real, what's the difference between whether it's a lawyer or a doctor and they store files or they store pipes? It's not an issue if you comply by having the tenant in the office building. Not that the board can't grant this variance. It's the board's call whether you grant the variance. I totally don't care whether you grant it or you don't grant it. I'm having trouble with why you need a bathroom for a storage user and why you can't use the existing bathroom for the storage user who also rents an office with a shingle. Joe Schmo, the plumber. I don't even care about the sign. I care about principal use versus accessory use. And if you rent space in the office, the storage becomes accessory to the office space. That's totally permissible.
Perhaps I can ask Ms. Cradiger what her thought is regarding tying some office space to the barn so that anyone who leases the barn automatically gets some office space in the office building. What is the owner's thoughts about that?
Whether they use it or not.
Well, I mean, the first thing I want to say is, personally, I thought I was supposed to be doing this legally. I mean, that was my thought. I mean,
But you weren't.
I put a tenant, and you're right, but I found out and I realized that I was not doing it the way it was supposed to be. And that's why I went through this process, because I thought if I want to put a tenant in there that doesn't have office space and take up office space that I have in the building, yes, some of it's empty, but I guess it doesn't, to me, I just thought I was trying to do the right thing to apply for the use variance.
Excuse me, I have to interrupt a second.
Yes.
Are you the owner?
No, I work for the owner.
Okay, so it's the owner. It's the owner that's doing it. You can say it's you, but it's the owner.
Okay.
Yeah, she works for the
No
owner.
one's questioning, Ms. Cradiger, no one's questioning that you've made an application and you're entitled to be heard.
Okay.
I'm just trying to help. I actually thought I was trying to help with the problem that appeared to be that you're not going to get this bathroom. And I see a solution to that problem, which also solves your use variance. And we can deal with it as a site plan now. That you can have a plumber, you can have an electrician, you can have a lawyer, you can have a doctor. And they can lease the storage space for their accessory use in your building on that property. And guess what? They get one more parking space too, because you do have parking apparently for 2,400 square feet. You claim, right? You claim you have one more parking space than needed for 2,400 square feet, apparently. So you get site plan approval, you get direction to Paul and to the zoning officer that you could have this kind of tenant, they could have storage. They have to have a key to the office building to use the bathroom. Doesn't sound so bad.
I understand what you're saying. I understand.
Can I just speak for a sec? This is Lou. There's a couple different issues here, and they can all be solved, mostly be solved by Tom's suggestion that you lease 200 square feet of an office and you get a bathroom with it. And by the way, you also get all this storage space in the garage, storage barn, and you also get a parking space with it. And you're completely legit, completely legal. If we go forward, and I'm going to go back to Paul maybe on this, if we go forward and have to approve this application, it opens up our review of the entire site. And I really do feel like the parking is an issue. And that might open up a whole kind of can of worms if we have to go forward and approve this application and or deny it. But Paul, maybe you can weigh in on that because the parking is an issue.
I agree.
Well, that was a question that I brought up. I'll leave it to Tom to how.
Yeah, this
handle it.
is a site plan application, no matter how you look at it. Every use variance that comes for a commercial site is a required site plan review as well. The whole thing is opened up by being a D variance with a site plan. And we can solve problems with that too, without granting the D variance. I'm really having trouble with why go this far. And Ms. Credinger, I don't want to criticize you. I'm not criticizing you at all. You've made an application that was great, but I also want to say this. We have to look at this a little bit like a blank slate. And the blank slate is called tabula rasa. And tabula rasa means you get no benefit by having used the tenancy without proper prior approval, but you get no detriment as a result of it too. So we're trying to deal with the practical problem, but one of the practical problems is it doesn't sound like, it sounded like 4 people were concerned about an extra bathroom in the office, in the storage space. Why are they concerned? They're concerned because that tenant may not do it the right way. That tenant may start using it for more than it should be used for. That tenant may start having an office there. And that's not what you want. That's not what the board wants. That's not what the zoning officer would be expecting. They're expecting storage only under your use variance. Expecting 1 parking space for 1 vehicle. That's all going to be enforceable by the township, but we don't have the greatest, we don't go into your storage building. It didn't happen in 7 years apparently. So it's not going to happen. But and what if B&D is not there, 10 years from now, and if somebody else and your B&D leases it out and the tenant doesn't care about the storage user. So let's just, I think we should go over the site plan a little bit, Mike, because I think that maybe what do you really want? You want to take a few minutes and think about it? You want to poll the board of where they want to go with this?
Well, why don't I suggest this after conferring briefly with my client via text. Perhaps we should carry this, and we can then between now and the next meeting discuss where we want to go with this. You're suggesting we withdraw the application and just continue to use the barn building for accessory storage, and it sounds like you're suggesting as long as the tenant has leases some office space in the office building, they can then use the barn building for storage. So perhaps we need to explore that a little bit between now and the next meeting. And if that works, then we'll simply withdraw the application. If on the other hand, we feel that we need to move forward with this application in another way, we can do that. Would that be
sounds
acceptable?
fine, Mike. And you can communicate with Paul Ferrero and the zoning officer in the interim too. Carol, are you okay with that? Carry them one month or something like that, and give them some time to assess what they really would like.
I think that's what they should do. Carry it and reconsider what their plan is. Yes.
And if you were in the interim, Mike, you work with Paul and with the zoning officer, you may be able to find, if there's something you need to stay with for just site plan approval, you can keep your pending application for a site plan approval of something specific that you might feel you need. I'm not saying
Right.
you do need anything, but if that helped you, also
Right.
you can come back and just say, well, no, we've decided to keep going for the D variance and site plan approval, and this is what we're willing to do. And the more you can elaborate on those conditions and their enforceability by the zoning officer from outside, with outside eyes, the better. Okay, so.
One item that perhaps we can get clarification on tonight is, I take it that we would be able to lease space in the office building to any office tenant. And then they could use the barn building for accessory purposes. It doesn't have to just be professional offices, correct? I mean, that office
I'm pretty
building
sure
has
that,
been,
I'm pretty sure in the VN zone district, you can do any retail or any offices. Is that right, Paul? Is there any limit?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have the ordinance open in front of me, but Michael I can look at that and we can talk over the next week.
Yeah,
okay.
I think work on that, Mike, and make sure that, the breadth of your uses of potential tenants is what you want. And maybe check your parking. If you really want to get formal approval of 11 spaces by some sort of arrangement, that could be, if that's feasible to do, that's something the board could grant without necessarily granting the D variances. But that's up to
Okay.
you when you come back. So we should carry to a date certain, Carol, and I
Yeah.
don't know.
4th, we could carry it to, we could have it, if that's enough time for you, we could do it March 4th.
You know what? I have another hearing on March 4th, unfortunately.
And we have Alfieri on 20, the other application on March 4th, so it would probably be the March 11th.
But we can go to March 11th then, Janine?
Yes.
Okay, March 11th,
Yeah, I think that should work.
and that should give you enough time?
I think it will.
Okay, then we'll carry it till the 11th, March 11th.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
So we're carrying B and D to March 11th at 7 PM. No additional notices required. Thank you, Mr. Osterman and the applicant.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
All right, I think that's all we have for tonight. And so anyone have anything they'd like to say further before we close? Not hearing anything, I guess we can have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, good night.
Aye. Good night, all.
Good night,
Stay
everybody.
safe.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.